everyone. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Dima, for the invitation, and thanks to the Nubia Initiative for getting these conversations started. I have been working in Sudan for, I guess, over the last 12 years or so, and working at the site of El Kuru that I'll be talking about today for the last 6 years. And I have become increasingly interested in the possibilities of working with local communities on heritage issues. So I want to talk about our archaeological discoveries at El Kuru, introduce you to the site, but I also want to talk about some of the ways that we have begun to work with local communities. And I'm actually quite interested in questions, comments, because in the context of the Nubia Initiative, the village I'm working in is not Nubian, or they don't consider themselves Nubian today. So exactly how these different contemporary identities work together in Sudan is a subject that I'm quite interested in. I hope that in the discussion that follows this session we'll be able to get into that. Another reason that I'm particularly interested in this is that if you think about it, archaeology is fundamentally a colonial discipline. So we go and traditionally archaeologists would go to some foreign place, gather information, knowledge, sometimes in the old days objects, and bring them all back without having this kind of concern with local communities. So this attention for me as a foreigner to heritage possibilities is also an attempt to move toward a post-colonial, more collaborative practice. Okay, so El Kuru is located in northern Sudan. It's about 400 kilometers north of Khartoum, near the modern town of Karima. Archaeological sites always begin, of course, with the ruins, the antiquities, the monuments. But in keeping with this attempt to move toward a collaborative model, I want to begin talking today with the people who live in El Kuru village. Part of the issue when you start with archaeology is that it's really alienating for everybody. And we see this in the practice of visitors who come to the site, that visitors are empowered to pretend that there are no people living there who would be worthy of meeting, having conversations with, learning about. And so anyway, I want to begin with the local people. So El Kuru is a village of about 3,000 people. The people who live in El Kuru are mostly Shaigia, an Arabic-speaking Muslim group, ethnic group, whose documented history extends back to the 16th century, when they established their independence from a regional power known as the Funj Sultanate of Sennar. Shaigia genealogies trace their descent even further back from an ancestor named Shaikh, who came from the Arabian Peninsula as early as the 7th century CE. But place names and local Arabic dialect make it clear that much of the population is actually descended from that of the medieval Nubian kingdom of Makuria. So this is one of the Christian kingdoms that spoke Nubian, even if there may also have been some immigration from Arabia. I also want to raise the issue of the term Nubia for ancient cultures, because of course Nubia as a term first appears in the historical record in about the 3rd century BCE. It's a Greek term originally, and it applied to a group called the Noba, who began to appear in historical records around that time. And of course, as we've heard, the local ancient name for the region was Kush. So El Kuru, the archaeological site, moving on to that, was first excavated by George Reisner on behalf of Harvard and the Boston Museum of Fine Arts in 1918 and 1919. Reisner discovered that the kings and queens of ancient Kush who were buried at El Kuru included most of the kings who conquered and ruled over Egypt as its 25th dynasty, as Solange was discussing, including Tanu Tamani, one of the kings she named. Reisner then brought most of the material from El Kuru back to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And for those of you who don't know, this museum has probably the finest collection of Nubian antiquities anywhere in the world. So the development of this cemetery at El Kuru is by now a standard part of the archaeology and history of ancient Kush. And here you have a reconstruction drawing. I'm going to have to explain this thing on the bottom because it's difficult to see, I think. There's a sequence of tomb architecture in this cemetery going from about 1000 BCE to around 650 or so, that traces a development from traditional Kushite burial forms to Egyptian burial forms. This is a very interesting sort of transformation that happens and serves as a prelude to Kushite conquest of Egypt and its justification as a purification of traditional Egyptian practices. So you can see on the sort of center right, there are some burial mounds. These are the traditional Kushite forms of burial. As the sequence develops in sort of a circular way, enclosure walls were built around the tumuli, and little chapels were built so that visitors could come and pay their respects to the deceased. And from those rounded forms, suddenly the burials move into what must have been ancient pyramids, and you can see a whole line of them there. And then there was a further leap in complexity with these burials with the arrival, the burial of Pianki, the conqueror of Egypt, who excavated a subterranean burial structure, built a burial vault, and inaugurated really the finest stage of the cemetery at El Kuru. With those 25th dynasty kings were also introduced the idea of burials of queens. And so at the top left, you'll see 5 pyramid burials, and those are all the burials of the ruling queens of Kush, who are also buried at El Kuru. So a part of this very interesting and important, historically important cultural development of the adoption of Egyptian forms of funerary practice included painting of tombs, and I'm just going, you may have to take my word for it looking at this image below, but this included the first use in Kush of Egyptian hieroglyphic writing, here in the form of funerary spells that were painted in the burial chamber. This particular image shows a moment when the mummy of Queen Kalhata was awoken in a sense by a god holding up the Ankh sign, the sign of life, to her face, and this is preparing her then to follow in the essentially Egyptian notion that she will fly each day with the sun god on his daily round through the skies and his nightly round through the underworld. I don't want to dwell too much on this, but this was a part of this development that Solange was talking about, in which the Kushites were claiming that they were restoring and really laying claim to all of this Egyptian burial practice. It just emphasizes the extent to which these two cultures became intertwined. All of these burials have been looted in antiquity, all of them, but the looters missed a lot of stuff, and so we can get some sense of the quality of craftsmanship of objects that would originally have been buried with these kings and queens. These particular objects were found not in the queen's burials that I showed you, but in some minor queen's burials. So the kings, of course, had many wives. And anyway, they testify again to this level of wealth. So El Kuru is part of a cluster of sites that together forms the capital region of ancient Kush from about 750 to 300 BC, something like that. And these sites include 2 major burial sites, El Kuru and then Nuri. It includes the temple center of Jebel Barkal that Solange mentioned. It includes a large administrative capital city at Sanam, which also housed the cemetery of something like over 1,500 people of non-royal descent, and another local cemetery recently discovered by accident in a village called Hilat al-Arab. So this is an area that my own research is focusing on. It also comprises a UNESCO World Heritage Site, one of 2 UNESCO World Heritage Sites in Sudan, the other being Merowe, the later capital of Kush. So we're actually, all of us who are working in these sites are bracing for a monitoring mission of UNESCO that's scheduled to come and evaluate the state of conservation and management of the sites this winter. So at Al Khuru, I have two co-directors that I wanted to recognize, Rachel Dan of the University of Copenhagen. She and I together have one project that is focused on conserving the tomb paintings and trying to find evidence of a royal town around the cemetery. That's my daughter leaving. She had a prior engagement. It's not that she hates me that much anyway.
Now that I know it's live streamed, I'll follow along.
Hi, Ruby. My other co-director, or my other colleague, is Abbas Sid Ahmed Muhammad Ali. And he leads a Sudanese team that is particularly focused on preparing the site for visitors, both in terms of protecting the site and interpretation. My research at the site, as I said, was focused on trying to identify remains of a royal town around the cemetery. And the reason we thought, it sort of makes sense that there should have been a royal town around the cemetery, but we also had reasons to think that there was because George Reisner, in his notebook, left these little sketches of architectural elements outside the pyramid burials, which he never published. He wasn't interested in them, and he didn't even locate them in the village. So our first challenge was just to go and try to relocate these elements of Reisner's potential city. And we tried all the high-tech kind of means that you could think of. We had high-resolution, multispectral satellite imagery, and we used subsurface geophysical testing and all this kind of thing. And we were getting nowhere. And so part of the issue with doing the kind of work the heritage work that I'm talking about, of course, is developing trust. Right? The people who lived in El Khuru had been living there for a long time. They didn't know us from anybody. And so finally, I don't know, some things went right, I guess. And an older gentleman who was interested in archaeology came up to us and said, you're looking for this structure? And he drew that plan in the sand on the side. You're looking for that? It's right here. And he came and he showed us exactly where it was. And so it turned out that it was a good sign for the collaboration to come. So from a combination of different efforts, we were able to find 4 of those remains. So the first was a big town wall. Here you can see 2 stretches of the wall that's separated by a gate. It's about 130 meters long, with corner bastions highly fortified. And associated with that were some houses and a cemetery that I will tell you about in a minute. This here is this well, a square rock-cut well with the stairs going around it. And here you see one of our local workmen trying out the stairs. 2 funerary temples. So the idea is these would be temples that were dedicated to the memory of a deceased king or queen. In this case, possibly a queen. And you can see that there's an outer room here with the rough floor, and then 2 underground rooms. This is a structure that's right in the middle of the village. In fact, excavating it required us to block a street that led to a bunch of people's houses. They were very patient with us, very nice. But we had to fill it back in for the normal functioning of the village. So that was unfortunate from the perspective of an archaeologist. But the larger funerary temple that we found is able to remain open. In fact, what we've been working on recently is trying to build a protective structure that would not diminish the visual impact of the site, but at the same time would protect this very, very fragile local sandstone. This is an almost unique form of a temple. There's only one other that's like it, and it's at the site of Nuri. It has 2 outer rooms, and you can see the second outer room has 26 columns in it. You can perhaps just see that there are doorways cut into the rock, so there's also an entire network of underground rooms in this temple that are here on the bottom of the plan. And it's so quite an interesting architectural form. Finally, so it was actually I have to tell you, quite terrifying excavating that underground temple. because the ceiling looked, I mean, I'd never worked underground before, but this looked like the ceiling was going to collapse on us every day. So we brought an architect from Spain who was used to building protective structures, and he said, you don't have to worry about that. But when he was there, we had also realized that the largest pyramid at the site had not been excavated by Reisner for exactly the same reason, that there was a concern of collapse of the ceiling, and so he just stopped excavating. So this gave us an opportunity to excavate a pyramid, really every archaeologist's dream. But it's huge. See, I think we removed 250 tons of sediment by hand from the staircase and the burial chambers underneath this pyramid. We did a film with National Geographic, Rise of the Black Pharaohs. I will say, it's as the scholarly expert who proposed this film, not every aspect of the film came out the way that I would have wanted it to. But nevertheless, it's an engaging portrayal of the kind of work that we were doing. So just to give you a very brief summary of the archaeological results, in addition to just locating those remains, it turned out that all of those remains were significantly later than the cemetery itself. So the largest pyramid at the site dates to the 4th century BC, and so really what that represents is a later ancestor coming back to be buried at the cemetery at El Kuru as a way of making a heritage connection, really, with the famous kings who had conquered Egypt. The pyramid and the large funerary temple with the underground rooms were actually never used. They were never finished and they were never used. That's a strange, and I can tell you, a disappointing result. Because we wanted to find, of course, a gold mask in the burial chamber of the pyramid. And what we found was that they had come all the way down. They had brought a 10-foot long granite slab that they were intending to set up and carve with the king's names and spells to protect him, and then they just left it there. So there's a historical mystery there that's interesting, and I won't go into it further here. Just to say that that's the result that we got from excavating those. The city wall, which initially is what really excited me, turned out to be medieval Christian in date, so very much part of the Nubian kingdom of Makuria. Okay, and so let me then return to this discussion about heritage, because when I first got to El Kuru, I was struck by the fact that the local people didn't seem to have a great deal of connection to ancient Kush. Even though these pyramids were in their backyard, they didn't really feel it to be of them in some way. And so there's a beautiful moment actually in the film where our foreman of workers, and now my good friend Mansour, was asked by the Egyptian cameraman, so what do you think about these pyramids that we're excavating? I'm going to read you what he said in English here, if I can find it. He said, these are my ancestors. My culture and civilization comes from them. I'm a part of them. We're very late. We should have been looking and learning from them a long time ago. And I really didn't want to implant any specific idea of heritage into their minds, but anyway, this is what developed. I've been given the 2-minute sign, so I'm going to talk faster. So we had 2 meetings with people in the community where we talked about our archaeological work, and this my growing idea of heritage connection. It was just beginning to take shape. So I made a presentation about our work, and that was all interesting. And I was really interested that the people in the village, the men who'd been working with us, had questions that were not questions I had considered. So I was really worried that they were going to be angry that all of the material that Reisner excavated was in Boston. But really their first serious question was about where are the bones of King Pianki? The object's okay, we could probably live with that, but if the bones of Pianki are in Boston, that's not going to be okay. So anyway, because all of these burials were looted, the bones were just fragmentary and scattered all over the burial site. There's no way to identify specific people. And so I told them, we don't know. There's no skeleton. There's no body of Pianki. And so then they immediately went into joking and said, "Oh, so we've been carrying them in our buckets in the the pyramid all this time." So that was fine. The next question was also quite interesting to me and surprising, and that was, do you think the ancient Kushites were darker in color than us? So it was a question about skin tone. And that was not part of my research agenda when I went to Kush, was to look into this question. In fact, it's a very complicated question, and I think, so they had their theory about it. And their theory was that because they traced some part of their ancestry from Arabia, they thought that they should be lighter, they must be lighter in color than the ancient Kushites. You know, and I mean, my own view about this is that there's been interchange between these cultures forever. And so I told them we would have to develop a new research project to look at that. But the reason I'm mentioning this is that they did have their own heritage questions, their own means of connection, their ways of relating to this culture. So we started having nudges in the direction of doing community archaeology heritage projects. A second nudge came from the funding that some of you may have heard about for archaeology and museums in Sudan. This comes from the government of Qatar. The government of Qatar pledged and has now paid out most of something like $135 million over 5 years to support archaeology, museums, and heritage projects in Sudan. And the idea that they have stated is that this is for tourism development. So all the archaeological projects are obligated to come up with some sort of a plan to leave the sites in a better shape for visitors than they were when they left. So we began talking with people in the village about what that would look like, and did they want to have interaction with visitors to the site. And what really got them finally excited about this, because I wasn't sure, it's a relatively traditional village, and you could imagine, I could have imagined responses that they didn't really want to have more interaction. But what really got them excited was the idea that visitors to the site could eat their food, and especially gurasa. This is the food that the people in this village are especially excited about. So we began developing these plans very, very quickly. We wanted to have local people be the ones who were presenting aspects of their local culture for visitors. And so we've had the last 2 years this very fun photo contest where people in the village can submit 5 photos. We have a big party, we show all the photos, and then a big panel of Hawajas, of foreigners, and people from the village judge, and we choose winners. And so these photos then, along with a description from the photographer of why this photograph is meaningful, will be the essence of the presentation of local culture in the village. And here are some of the winning photos from the first photo contest. I love the fact that picture of cows that made it. That was one of the winning photos. And traditionally Kush has been a cattle culture, and cattle have always been symbolically important, and that was a good illustration of that. I just have 2 more slides. Another indication of this kind of growing local interest and engagement with heritage was that this young man, Hamoud Ibrahim, all on his own, talked to a bunch of people, got some of their older items, and made a museum of local culture in the village. So he is now officially the curator of the local culture part of the exhibit. We've designed a heritage center, and right now a big part of my work is trying to figure out how this can be developed in a sustainable way. That's a little bit challenging, so it's basically setting up a business model for how this will work. We will need to talk with Abdullah about how they have done this in Kerma. That's a much longer running project, but a great model. And so I will end just with a statement that part of the real pleasure for us as foreigners in developing this project is that this village and these people have they've been so wonderful to live with and work with, and we're very happy with the idea that we'll be able to share some of that experience with visitors who can come to the Heritage Center. So thank you for your attention.